So today we're going to talk about cybersecurity threats and you. And I called this ready or not, but I really kind of should have punctuated it differently, as in ready, not, because my contention is even the most sophisticated cybersecurity folks are not quite ready for what's about to happen. And let me share that with you. First, just a quick intro on us. I'm not going to read you this slide. We are a 21-year-old consulting advisory firm. As Swami said, we specialize in a number of key areas for the purposes of this event. That big red box that says cybersecurity, it's something I've been doing throughout my entire career, which started way back in the last century. We are obviously very happy to help you with addressing your naughty cybersecurity problems. So contact me if after this event you think you have questions. With that, the first thing I want to talk about is how much things have changed so that we can put things in the perspective of how much things are going to change. So here is the best way I've been able to sort of graphically explain what the heck has been happening and what is going to happen. So let's dial the Wayback Machine and look at 2018. By the way, this exercise is really quite interesting because in my head, 2018 is not very long ago. If you think about it, it was 2 years before COVID. It was the last couple years of the before times. But it was pretty far already into this century. Quite a lot of the major shifts had already happened. The move to cloud, zero trust, all these things had happened by 2018. So we were kind of in the modern era, relatively speaking. Well, yes, but no. Okay, so some of the threats that were there continue to be today, things like data breach, but people were talking a lot about DDoS. Now, DDoS is always going to be a problem, but it really was top of mind back in 2018 in a way that it is not currently top of mind today, although it continues to be important. What was going on in the regulatory environment? Well, let's see. The NIST framework. Whoops, there we go. The updated NIST framework, I would say the first really usable NIST framework popped out in 2018. That's relevant because today, 5 years later, in 2023, that is actually the most common framework that most of the folks that we work with use, followed by the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So that was just really beginning 5 years ago. I mean, it had been around, but this is the really solid one. We also saw the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions was issuing a DDoS memorandum. Hey, financial firms, watch out for this. It can happen. This is what you need to do about it. Another reason DDoS was top of mind. What else was happening in 2018? GDPR. It was the very early. I mean, I know it's been there forever, but at the time it was that big thing that was coming down the pike and was going to change the way we had to do everything. And all of our data centers had to be thought about, and we had to redo privacy and everything else. And that happened. And that was really only 5 years ago. It seems like it has been there permanently. I also remember the New York State Department of Financial Services, the cybersecurity regulation. That was a very, very big deal. And getting preparedness and readiness and getting your assessment done was a very big deal back 5 years ago. Oh, yeah. This is actually important because it sort of snuck in under the wire, under the radar is what I'm really trying to say, which is the U.S. Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control issued a finding that essentially, if you pay off ransomware attackers, if they are nation state attackers, you are now giving money to a hostile nation state, and that turns out to be illegal. What's interesting is quite a lot of really large, sophisticated companies are actually unaware of this. In fact, very recently, you've seen in Las Vegas, one of two major companies that got hit did, in fact, pay the attackers. No word on who they were, but to the extent that they were linked to nation state attackers, those companies could be in a world of hurt. Right now, it doesn't mean anybody's going to jail. It does mean big fines. Meanwhile, speaking of nation state attackers, I had been writing about them, preaching about them, grabbing people by the lapels and shaking them to talk about them. And they're really starting to hit, and they've become completely mainstream since, they sort of first came on most people's radar in, 2018, 2019 or thereabouts. Back in 2018, I was writing about nation state attackers, and people were saying, are you sure? Are they going to come after me? Now it's like, oh yeah, of course, Johna, we have our nation state threat protection in place. Okay, great. Supply chain attacks, kind of similar. Back in the day, especially financial services firms were kind of like, Johna, it's not like we're getting, it's not like we're getting widgets and we have a problem if the widgets break. Now there's an increased awareness, thank you, SEC, as we'll talk about in just a second. There's an increased awareness of the virtualized supply chain. So now you're getting software, you're getting services, you're getting cloud services. Oh gosh, that's all part of your supply chain. We'll talk about that in a second. Speaking of supply chains, believe it or not, this was in I want to say 2020 or 2021. Was the executive order 14028 on software bill of materials, SBOMs. Guess what? SBOMs, the executive order on SBOMs was actually that the federal government had to begin protecting actively um, their software bill of materials, which is software supply chains, basically. And that is front and center for regulation. And we're going to see a lot more regulation around that and software supply chains as we move forward. Um, so these are some of the regulatory things that have changed. Now, here we are all the way in 2023. What's going to happen later in 2023? Well, in December, the SEC's Cybersecurity Risk Management Strategy, Governance and Incident Disclosure, as they like to call it, is going to take effect. Depending on what you mean by take effect, the earliest it starts is December 15th this year. Most organizations, and certainly almost all financial services organizations, are well aware that what it's telling us is, gosh, we need to report material breaches and any material efforts that we make in cybersecurity. So we need to be prepared to report these things. So on our 8K. That's all well and good, but if you drill down into it, it also says, and I think the Harvard Law Review, not the Law Review, but one of the Harvard publications actually pointed out that the SEC explicitly declined to remove responsibility from third party and fourth party vendors. And that's kind of a legalese for saying, if you are getting a cloud service and your cloud service is breached, you need to know that and tell the SEC and make that disclosure if it's a material breach. What the SEC sort of clarified is, well, you don't need to know it if the cloud service hides it. You don't have to hire like private investigators and cybersecurity researchers to figure this out. You're not liable to that level. But if it's something that has happened, just because it's a cloud service provider doesn't mean that you aren't responsible for sharing that information with your customers and more broadly with your shareholders and with the SEC. But it goes further, as they say, but wait, there's more. If your cloud service provider is using a data center somewhere and that data center is subjected to a breach, you are still responsible for sharing that if it's a material breach. Again, modulo the definition of material with your shareholders, with the SEC, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't, basically the takeaway according to the legal beagles is you don't have to go to extreme efforts to uncover things that other people are hiding from you. You can't be held responsible for that, but you are responsible if something happens to that data center that affects that cloud service provider that affects you, and you have to report it. That's a big deal. And one of my clients actually kind of reacted with some outrage saying, that's crazy. How can they do that? And I said, well, you got to look at it as if this were not just financial services, but food, right? So basically, if you're in the business of selling food and you've suddenly discovered that your food has arsenic in it, it doesn't matter whether the arsenic came from you, whether it came from, the people that were spraying the vegetables or whatever it was, you're still going to kill people and you're still responsible and you need to take it off the shelves right away, even if you're the grocery store. You're the end of this supply chain. Now, we're not talking, hopefully most of the time, life and death issues, but still that notion of shared responsibility and really cumulative responsibility is a new one. And companies are still grappling with that and what it means. I'm spending a lot of time on that point because our good friends over at Deloitte have also looked at the fact that most public companies, as in 90% of them, do not have the appropriate control points in place to figure out that their supply chains have been breached and do something about them. This is a very big deal, and expect to hear a lot more about this in the future. Oh, by the way, while I'm scaring you, there's also the Chinese PIPL, which is essentially they position this as GDPR, but it's not really GDPR. It is actually more of a, I call it, all your data are belong to us kind of regulation, which gives them the explicit right to go snooping in your systems. I don't have time to go through this in great detail, but net, if you are doing business with China, in November this year, they're going to start enforcing, that's like next month. They're going to start enforcing PIPL. You really want to make sure that you have air gapped almost every system you've got that could potentially, in any scenario, have Chinese PII, and also that you have protected against data going into those those systems, because they can go. The Chinese have the right, according to PIPL, have the right to go into your systems regardless of where they are, inside or outside of China, if they have a reason to believe that you are in breach of PIPL. Long story there. It's scary. What's my point? And you guys can read all the rest of this: AI attacks, the quantum cryptocalypse, when quantum eventually breaks all the common encryption algorithms. You've probably heard about that. You can probably expect AI regulation. Congress is meeting as we speak today to talk about what they need to be doing for AI regulation. Quantum regulation is going to be hot on its heels. The main point is all these breaches, everything we used to have to deal with is still here, and a whole bunch of new things are happening, and all the old regulation is still here, and a bunch of scary new regulation is coming down the pike right now. So if ever there was a time when we were stuck doing more with less, it's now. The state of the art. Well, and I've got footnotes for where this data comes from. The state of the art from a defense perspective. About 2/3 of organizations are deploying zero trust, and about 75% see real value in deploying it. So not everybody that sees the value is deploying. As I mentioned earlier, 75% of folks are deploying nation state threat monitoring, and about the same amount see real value. So that's being deployed to the right level. Interestingly, one of the gaps that is likely to exist in your organization is social media collaboration security, with 50% deploying and 71% seeing real value. So, in other words, if you don't have additional cybersecurity layered on top of what you're doing with social media and collaboration, including but not limited to Microsoft Teams, you've probably got a vulnerability. API management, this is something that a lot of folks got on early. I'd say the ability to appreciate the value is catching up, is a nice way to put it, to the API management. We do see that most organizations are doing incident response hardening via tabletop exercises with the technical folks, IT and cybersecurity, and the operational incident response team at least once a year. What they are not doing, and this is really critical, is incident response hardening via tabletop exercises, including senior management. This is a much bigger deal. Again, I could do an entire presentation on the impact of PIPL. I can do an entire presentation on the impact of the SEC ruling, and I can do an entire presentation on incident response hardening. If you're listening to this, your takeaway should be, hey, if we're not doing it at least once a year, and actually quarterly is better for the technical ones, and at least annually, and ideally twice a year for the senior executives, you're doing something wrong. Most companies have not even begun to grapple with AI-based attacks and vulnerabilities. What I mean by this is, what holes does AI open up in your data? Case in point, it's actually possible for AI to reconstruct PII from data that doesn't actually contain PII. So in other words, AI can look at what your employees are doing and figure out what their PII is and share that or be hacked. So how are we addressing that vulnerability? And then I just mentioned, just 11% of organizations have control points for that third-party supply chain vulnerability. So net, we're doing great at protecting against yesterday's threats. Tomorrow's, not so much. The very big picture here is when I talk to CISOs and CIOs and risk officers and board members, they kind of feel like, cybersecurity, we got that, Johna. We know what we're doing. We got the right tools. We got the right technologies. We got the processes. Everything's good. What we're trying to do right now is just sort of optimize the products that we're using. Maybe we can drop a couple from our portfolio because the juice isn't worth the squeeze. But at the same time they're doing this, there's a disconnect between this slide and the previous slide, which is, wait a minute, the threats are getting worse. The regulatory environment is getting more strenuous. You know, threats threats and regulations are effectively unfunded mandates that say you need to be investing more in your cybersecurity, and yet the general attitude is we're good. And in fact, when we ask people, we're in the process of a cybersecurity research study at this very moment. And when we ask people what they're doing for cybersecurity, the general response is, we're not planning to spend more next year. We're good. So my conclusion is threats are getting worse. Regulation is getting more stringent. I won't say worse. And spending is staying flat. That's a gap. That's a problem. So, no one expects nation state attacks. Make sure you're prepared. Try to assess your investment intelligently on its ability to reduce key metrics, such as the median total time to contain breaches and the serious incident per incident. And you're going to hear a lot about this from the next presenter and in our panel, but really pay attention to incident readiness and response. It needs to be ongoing, practiced, constantly involving, and multifaceted. You'll want to think about cyber resilience at every stage of the data and supply chain lifecycle, either because it's a good idea or because you have to, because the SEC tells you to. AI and ML, they're great as defensive tools. Most people have been using cybersecurity tools that include them for the past 5 years at least. Guess what? Hackers use them too. So watch out. And I just lightly touched on it, but a whole exciting, interesting area is that the quantum cryptocalypse is almost here. It's not here yet, but there are worrying signs that it's getting here faster than most experts, including me, have suggested it will get here. So that's another thing to pay attention to. So essentially, on that list, it's worth revisiting to make sure that you're very comfortable with your strategy towards nation state attacks, your assessing investment based on its ability to actually measurably improve your security stance, your incident readiness and response, both at the technical level and at the senior executive level, and then this supply chain SBOM all across the supply chain cyber resilience. So these are all the fun, interesting things. I hope I've scared you a little bit, because complacency is not a mindset that anyone wants to have when you're dealing with cybersecurity. If you're worried about justifying a budget, now is an excellent time to start having that conversation, because you may be needing to consider a budget increase, and senior management may be thinking that wasn't in their plans. And hopefully this presentation will help you justify some of that.